thank you, Rik Hart, for agreeing to once again be interviewed by Central Coast newspapers. What we're trying to crack open today is a broad view and narrative of what happened to the council's books over the last 5 or 6 years. I know you've done a lot of work on the staff in putting an explanatory note and graphics together, and I thought you could talk us through that.
I'd be absolutely delighted to, because the story is actually quite simple. We just need to remember at the beginning, what I tell you is actually how we found the organisation when the administrator and I arrived, and what we've done to sort of fix it up. But we have had to go back and look at a little bit of the history from the day of merger onwards. I do want to stress at this point in time there is, and we will be putting that in a council paper going up I think next week, that there has been no evidence whatsoever of any corruption or fraud. It has just been as simple as just taking their eye off the ball, as I'll explain when we go through some of these slides. And so hopefully your audience will be able to follow me. Our staff fortunately have been able to follow me, which is why they've been, and whilst they're not happy, they at least understand as to how things have come about. And they've been part of the solution as we've needed to work with the unions in a cooperative manner to actually sort out the issues for the rest of the decade.
I'd like to jump, before we go back to the long-term view, to the situation you found yourself in as far as operating surpluses, or in this case deficits, are concerned, and how that developed over the 5 years. I know you have a graphic that shows that. So at amalgamation there was a little bit of cash in the kitty, and then an operating surplus. Could you talk us through those years and how that developed over the years?
It'd be easy if I can sit and look at, if we can show the original graphic, which I've got here in front of me. But in short, yes, the organisation on paper looked like it had quite a lot of working capital or free monies at the time of merger. In reality it didn't, and I can explain that a little bit down the track as to how that came about. So it started with a very low working capital, somewhere in the order of around 5 million, 4.89 or something from memory. So that was how it started. Over the years since that point in time, it did make an operating surplus of 65 odd million in its first year of operations. That largely came about because, one, the previous council, particularly Gosford, had reduced its salary line by around $12 million to the day of merger, so it was a low number then, if you like, and probably somewhat artificial. I think we needed some of those people to make sure that the services were being continued. So that took place at that time, and the other thing that sort of occurred around that time was the fact that the state government provided $40+ million worth of grants to be used. So in that year, we have to receipt it or book it into the P&L, the income and expenditure line. We have to book it in that year, so it showed all of that money coming in that year. But it is not spent until over some of the out years. So
these are for road infrastructure, pipes?
For road infrastructures, for the IT, all that monies that came in, which the organisation was eligible for. But what that has the impact of doing is that you have to show that income as that 40 million in that 2017 year
of receipt,
which was the year that we actually demonstrated where we made a $65 million profit. So most of it wasn't spent, but it was spent in the years following it. And after that, there hasn't been any years where surpluses have been produced. So it's just been 3 successive years then of losses, which added to some more capital expenditure. It means that we ran into deficit positions, which meant that they were withdrawing funds from externally and internally restricted reserves to pay for it.
This seems to be the crux of the issue, that the horse had bolted and it wasn't led back to the paddock, as it were. The worsening situation on the operational deficit seemed to be the thing, that the direction it was going. I think the administrator said the direction it was going was very poor.
Absolutely right. I guess the question I ask myself is, how did the organisation, at all levels, so both political and management levels, how did they think they were actually funding deficits, COVID, bushfires, capital expenditure, without making excess money? That's the thing. So most people in their home life know pretty much how much money they're getting in from their salary, and they adjust their expenditure accordingly to live, generally speaking, within their means. but they keep a pretty close eye on what's coming in, their cash, and what's going out in terms of cash. In this case, the organisation didn't do that, and therefore they ended up, technically speaking, running out of usable cash. In other words,
there seems to be no direct rational answer to that question that we have found. Were there any income sources that were to be put in the future, or efficiencies that were gained that could have brought the budget back to surplus naturally without the intervention?
They could have easily curtailed expenditure, and I think, as the Administrator has pointed out a number of times, you can't take a $40 million hit to your revenue line from water and sewer without immediately putting things into practice. And that's the thing we've been working with the Executive at the moment as we speak. We say we've got to look at next year forward, and we've got to make sure that that balances the book to be consistent with the budgets that we've put forward to the banks in order to secure loans, and what we've put forward to the state government in order to get the state government agreeing that pathway forward. So in doing that, the Executive have had to make those decisions. So we are in the process of, about on Wednesday, we're going to go to the Consultative Committee to talk through with the Consultative Committee inside, which is the committee which is set up under the award, which all councils must have, whereby the senior management must discuss with the union and the union delegates and so on proposed changes. So we have to go through that process. In doing so, as I've said, the unions have worked very cooperatively with us, and they're aware of what we're targeting, which is a salary line, not a number of staff. And that some number is $275.5 million, round numbers, and that's the line we get to. So what we have done that work, Executive have been finalising that over the weekend, this weekend just been, and we're ready now to go to the Consultative Committee on Wednesday, where we start those discussions. Some of the key players that that may be impacted upon has been discussed with them already, so there won't be a complete surprise. The process then is that that'll be out for a month's consultation with staff. We can't move much around the dollars and the numbers, obviously. So we'll do the month, and then just prior to Easter that'll come back from consultation, and then post Easter we'll be starting to look at actually downsizing the entity to the right number.
So that's why, as you've said before, that you're committed to making a small surplus for the council in the next financial year. Is that
Correct.
that the major part of that restructure?
It has to be. It has to be. We have to produce surpluses. The organisation has had all these years of losing money. It now has to get its house in order, which means, particularly in terms of what it spends on capital and what it spends on staff and the services it delivers. The other thing that I need to be very clear about, there is a trade-off between the 15% rate increase that's proposed that is necessary to get. You're well aware of the concern that the community has expressed about that number. So what we've chosen to do is to go with a rate increase which is, I'm going to say, about the maximum that people would be prepared to even consider, combined with a slightly lower level of service. So by that way we're being cognizant of the ability for some people to be able to pay for an increased rate, but at the same time we are dropping the service level a little bit to make sure that we can keep the rate increase lower. So that the combined effect is a 15% rate increase. You will get a reduction in the level of service. It's not marked, but it will be noticeable, and that's just going to have to be lived with for the time being. But what it hasn't taken into consideration looking forward is the fact there is an awful lot of room for improvement in the way the organisation operates in terms of efficiency gains. So I have to say that the Administrator and I coming in have found very little evidence that there's been much or any gains really since the day of merger in terms of efficiency, effectiveness and everything else.
Which surely was the goal of an amalgamation in the first place.
Should have been the goal, and that is what most organisations did move down that track. So we, for example, still operate 7 depots, which is probably a number too many, but I don't know what the right number is, and what we operate and what sort of services we operate out of each one of those. So there's all of that to look at and do some work with. But in terms of the staff reduction, the biggest hit in terms of staff reductions has been in the corporate services area, the overheads if you like. which has been much higher than in the frontline areas. So I think when you see, which we will be able to talk about once I've discussed with staff and gone through the proper process there, you'll be able to see that we have actually taken a hit right across the organisation. There's no one area that's been hit harder than others. We have dropped a number of areas which weren't mission critical. So we're back to the basics of roads, rates and rubbish sort of stuff. But that's been pretty evenly handed the way we've gone across that whole area. But predominantly, corporate has taken the biggest hit, which is what you might expect. We've cut the overheads.
What's the makeup of council's income?
The makeup of council's income is basically user fees and charges. Car parking, sports fields, ground use, community hires, all that side of things. These rates from general property and from business and from farmland, those sort of three categories, and from water and sewer across all categories. So those are the predominant, and there's some very tiny income that comes in from interest on investments and sale of assets. Those are basically the only income streamlines.
And what about the state and federal government contributions? How are they?
That's
budgeted? Because they're irregular.
I'm going to start by saying there's no free lunch. So every time a Commonwealth or a state gives us a capital grant to be spent on something, on a capital purpose, the problem was with that, it buys the asset or pays for the asset to go on the ground. When the asset's on the ground, we then have to, unfortunately, depreciate it, which is, if you use around 2% of the value, is approximately what you might use for a fixed asset, depending on what it is, but 2% would be the general norm for depreciation, and then you've got the operating side. So you've got repairs, maintenance, staff to operate it, whatever it might be. So the trouble is, you get a free asset, but it increases your costs.
Now this must be, this is a big issue across councils.
Correct.
Across the whole country.
Correct.
That increasingly complex infrastructure requires increasingly complex maintenance. And I think we see that on the Central Coast a great deal.
You've actually had more of a problem here than probably a lot of councils had. This area gets a lot of free money. Adam Crouch does a great job in finding money and giving money to the organisation. The problem is when you've got rate capping, which limits your income, you start getting this build-up of assets and you're not getting the revenue to look after them. So that's the simple explanation why they're not a good thing from a capital point of view. If we get operational grants, so for example the state government from the Department of Planning might give us some money to help develop the LEP. Now that's useful because that actually operational can pay for staff to come on to speed up that process, and providing that the staff disappear at the end of the grant, that works fine for us because we actually, it pays for the staff, it's paying for that, and we can account for that in our income and expenditure. But with the capital thing, we exclude capital grants and contributions, and all the numbers I talk about here will be excluding capital grants and contributions simply because it's not money you can use to run your business.
No, it's for a particular purpose.
It's for a set particular purpose, correct, yeah.
In fact, as you just said, it can be a burden on the overall budget. Through maintenance and so on.
So all councils, as you quite rightly point out, have this issue, and it does mean that all councils eventually have to go through the IPART process to get a rate increase.
It's
variation. It's inescapable.
Now, if we go back to expenditure per se, the stated goal of amalgamation was to gain efficiencies and to reduce overheads, mainly staff, but also other things. In the charts that you've provided to us, it just seems to be growing, which seem to be counterintuitive to what management and a board council would put together. Why and how did that happen? Is there a particular series of processes that can explain that?
I think one of the processes, and as I said, I'd like to get down where I can talk through these numbers because I can demonstrate it. One of the things is that pre-merger, particularly Gosford Council, reduced its staff numbers down prior to the merger. This was something that a number of councils going into the merger did. They actually they didn't downsize like we're having to. They just didn't replace staff over that once once Fit for the Future came in and they needed to demonstrate that they were earning more than they were spending, they just let the employee line just slowly diminish down by not replacing staff. So it's hard to know exactly on the day of merger, did they have the right staff, number of staff for the service that they were intending to produce.
So if my interpretation of what you just said is perhaps the natural staff number overall would have been slightly higher than it is, than it actually was.
Correct, and that's really how we came about calculating the cost number, was based on the fact if you took out that and said it had been a consistent number of staff running through, which for example Wyong had a consistent number of staff. We did the same thing on the cost side for Gosford. We end up with a figure when we capitalise that back out over the number of years, we end up with a number of about 175 million as to what that number should look like. So in the discussions with the union and sorting out next year's budgets and so on, we've said we can't have staff costs at more than $175 million. So again, that's not talking about the numbers of staff. It translates obviously, but it is a cost thing that is more important. And that's something I think that the previous council up till now haven't kept a handle on, because the staff numbers just escalated up quite large time. So we're going to be coming down in staff numbers to probably pre-merger in terms of staff numbers, but that's yet to be finalised because we've got the cost down, but it's got to translate into people, because you could have, one part-timer and two, we could have part-time roles staying on and full-times going, and it's quite a complicated process getting there, and that's why it's taken so long to get there. And
you need to manage service levels, I'm agreeing. I mean, there's surely some fear that you're getting rid of the wrong people or whatever it may be. There
undoubtedly will be some commentary around that. That's our best guess at this point in time to do it. In order to get it down. So I can't pretend in anything else. It's a fairly blunt instrument that we use to get here because of time pressures. We didn't have sort of the luxury of time. It'll be up to, if there's a future council, for them to sort of look around and play within the playing field. So the playing field will be set from a budgetary point of view, but within that they can play around with it. If they want to put a bit more service level somewhere here, then they've got to take a bit of a service level away from there. So they have free choice to do that. And so whether it's an administrator or a council in the future, both of them have that flexibility to do that based on what the community think. What I'm intending this year is with the administrator, we will put out a budget that says this is the budget for the next 10 years, particularly obviously focusing on the next 4. These are the projects we're able to do within that. And we'll be reporting all that online as to how we're travelling against that. So that'll
to introduce some transparency and
that'll give everybody the opportunity to have a look at it, and they'll be able to immediately tackle or ask the questions when they start to see expenditure starting to exceed income.
So this ambition level, which really it would appear goes down to the council's ambition and employment of various people and consultants in those last particularly 2 years, seems to have got away from itself. Is there still a clearer answer why that happened?
Well,
is there a particular budget?
There was definitely the council itself wanted to do some different things and put forward some ideas and discussed with the staff, obviously, about how they could do that. That culminated in expenditure happening. What I'm not entirely privy to is exactly how strongly people argued it was unaffordable or not. Dick and I have not seen a lot of evidence that there was a lot of pushback from the staff about things. There was a period in there where the financials were pretty rubbery, because when they brought the financial systems together, and particularly the computer software that runs all that, they were without much in the way of financial information for some considerable time, which certainly wouldn't have helped. But it appears no one went back and did the basic old trick of cash in, cash out. There's more coming in than's going out, and then keeping a tab of that. The other thing that it's not an excuse at all, but when you have it all in one bank account, which by the way is the right way to run it, and not to have separate bank accounts all over the show, when it's all in one bank account, it looks like there's a lot of money there. So at a cursory look, you say, there's 300-400 million sitting in a bank account. Well, we've got to be able to afford these things. What wasn't done is very meticulously keeping track of what came in from waste charges, from developers' contributions, and making sure that what's called a bank reconciliation, checking that the reconciliation between that and what was in the bank account matched up. What's left over is your working capital, the free money. So that's what obviously wasn't done, and there didn't seem to be an understanding. The only money you can really spend out of that is your free money, your working capital. So they just kept taking money out of the bank account, so they had cash to pay for things. But as we know, some of that, wasn't the right thing to do.
All right, Rik, if you wouldn't mind taking us through the slides that you've so diligently prepared with staff.
Okay, well, thank you. What we'll do is we'll go back in the end of the financial year in June 13, and we'll just take it as we move forward with the changes in revenue and changes in staff costs, because that's been one of the key things that people have focused on, and we've certainly had to focus on in our time here. So if I go back to June 13, the blue line represents the income that we get from rates and water and sewer. So that blue line goes all the way down to here. And then the green line represents what we get from grants and other things from the state, other income and revenue. So that's revenue like fees for the use of sports fields or the hire of community halls, car parking fees, and or parking fees, and that sort of revenue stream is in that green line. We have some other income, and it's minor, which is largely made up of income from investments. So the money we do have, which is on deposit, gets us interest and so on. So that's probably a key component of the light green line. So those are our principal revenue streams. The blue from the rates and fees and charges from water and sewer, the other fees and charges that come in, as I've mentioned, and then the final one there. So I want to just focus on, as we go back, you can see during that period right up to the merger, which is this point here. So the revenue line was growing pretty much at the standard rate cap. So it grows by the rate cap all the way up, which is around 2.5% per annum through that period. So you can see very consistent. You can see that the grants, which is often from state government or federal government and so on, they came in, and you can see that they actually started to decline a little bit in the amalgamation, but then there was a big sharp boost up. And that's when they got 40 odd million of state grants, which all councils got a certain amount. Most of them got around $20 million, which was 10 million to go on projects and $10 million to go on the organisation. So all councils got around, of the larger councils that is, got around that 20 million. In this case, the state government was quite generous and gave a further 20 million during that period. So that money came in during that financial year at the end of 17, the year of merger, and then it actually gets spent over these out years. But that's why you had an income, higher income there. Then the state government froze the rates for the first period after that point in time, and you see that reflected through that period there, through till the June 19. Then IPART did a determination on water and sewer charges, and that took $39 million off the revenue line. So you can see that sharp decline there and the amount of revenue that came down. Now if we switch away from the revenue and we start talking about staff costs, which is the red line. So you can see in the years leading up to the sort of up to the amalgamation, you start around back in 13, you had a total of 166 million. So that's a big combined cost of both Wyong, the former Wyong and former Gosford, combined staff costs were there. Then they started to decline, and they ended up being at 154 million at the year of merger, which in actual fact is $12 million less. Bear in mind the number of staff they were reporting, okay, was staying exactly the same all the way through. So those are staff positions. So what it meant is they were declining or not replacing staff during that period. Because every year the costs under the award have to go up by around about 3%. So that 166 should have been increasing like that at 3% up if all the staff had been on board. But you can see there was quite a change down. So at the time of merger you had less staff around to the tune of $12 million, which when you inflate it up, takes it up to around $20 million worth of staff costs, that you were less in that period, which is quite a few staff that are less. So that's a question mark as to did they actually have enough staff on merger to actually deliver the services that they said they were. Ad hoc information from the Gosford area says, well, no, they didn't, that they were, things were not being done that should have been done and all the rest. So my suspicion is that Gosford particularly was definitely reducing staff. And I might add, a number of councils going into the merger did that in that period to try and make themselves look much better for fit for the future, because clearly they've made their revenue to their expenditure balance look much better if they had less costs. So if we fast forward through to here, you can see that from the day of merger, the staff costs increased dramatically to the year 30th of June last year, which is the last financial year that we still haven't yet signed off on. You can see the costs went up to $220 million from where it should have been a number probably around the 175 mark here if you took a proper line through there. So we've set a line of 175 so that our next budget over here is down at around the 175 mark, which I'll talk to in a moment. So that's pretty much all we can show you there, but it's about 250 new staff. In actual fact, they created a lot more positions. You can see the number of positions was actually about another 500 or 600 more than they had at merger, but they didn't have people in all those positions. So that's that one.
We go to the surplus and the deficits situation.
So, I now just want to talk about going from the merger, what actually happened with the bottom line, because clearly the bottom line becomes all important. So in that first year of merger, I mentioned that they got some extra revenue, the 40 odd million that they got from the state grants and so on. They had the low costs of the salaries that had come in at that point in time. They were below what I think they should have been. So that first year, they actually showed a surplus of $65 million. Thereafterwards, as they increased more staff, some of it which probably was necessary in order to maintain the service levels, they then continued to increase staff, and you can see the losses just became accumulative. 22 million in 2018, another 5 million in the June 19 year, and the well-documented 89 million in last year. And we are forecasting, and bear in mind this is back at the end of, we were doing this work at the beginning of November, so our forecast then at the quarterly report at the end of December was we'd be losing 115. So all the data I'm talking about is based on that early days. Our position has changed now. Obviously we've been improving, but I won't complicate things. I'll keep it at the simple. So we'll use the 115. So we had cumulated losses going down like that right up until June. The other thing that happened that we need to be very conscious of is they kept their capital expenditure, you can see, from 17 all the way through, and that's about what the organisation can handle, around about the $170 million worth of capital. That actually keeps the current assets in their current state of repair and maintenance. It does not make them better, it just keeps them where they are. So that keeps your roads without potholes for those that don't have potholes, for those that are a Category 5 road that might have a few potholes, well, it's going to stay like that. So it is keeping it that capital expenditure at a standard level. For some reason, in June 20, when they had the big loss, they in actual fact spent this extra 39 million, this extra 70 odd million, $69 million on capital works. So you can see that chunk went up like that. And when we came in here, Dick and I, we found that the budget was up around 225. So again, way above these ones here. So coming back, what was something that had been done, again, you have to ask the question, why were they saying we could spend another 70 odd million dollars on CapEx over here, when, well, sorry, it would have been 50 million, another 50 million on CapEx when no one was keeping tabs of what was there. So that's a significant thing there, and it's been pulled back, and the line now will continue on in the out years at around that 170 million. So what we then look at, before I pull it all together, I want to look back at what was reported in the annual report signed off by auditors in the first year of amalgamation. There's a couple of areas where in the annual accounts, the council has to declare, and this is under Note 6C, it has to state its restricted cash, cash equivalents and investments and the details of it. And it shows the years. You have to look at what is externally restricted, 124 million shown here, what is internally restricted, 111 million, and unrestricted, 93. Now, in that 93, there was, we believe, $88 million of water and sewer that was restricted. Because when you go to the statement of financial position under the council's water supply and their statement of financial position for the sewerage supply, it shows the cash and current assets, cash and cash equivalents of these when you total it up, and these when you total it up, total $88 million. But we know that under the government accounting policies, as they existed, that is restricted. So on one hand, it's showing as unrestricted, and the other hand, it's showing as restricted.
So this legitimately is a problem for new board members / councillors to come in and have a look at these.
I think as councillors looked at that, or the community looked at that number, you would have said, yes, the council has $93 million of working capital or unrestricted funds. Now, I don't think for a moment anyone did look at that. I need to be clear. I don't think anyone looked at it and made that decision. After all the events, I think people may look back and say that they did, but I don't believe anyone at the time felt or understood this. So that is a key thing that we discovered, the CFO and myself, when we started to look at things here. So that's important to keep in the back of your mind, that in actual fact, this organisation, if that's true, that 88 million of that 93 is actually restricted, as it should be there, and recorded as such, then the actual working capital amount of free money was actually $4.66 million. That's it.
Not a lot for a
Not a lot for a $700+ million turnover business. To put it into perspective, a payroll for us is around $4.5 million, 1 week's payroll. So it barely covered 1 week's payroll. Okay, so now I just want to look at the actual cash movements. So you recall that we had approximately 5 million, the 4.66, in the bank at time of merger. Now that's free money, able to be spent on anything. It's not restricted in any shape or format, and I'll refer to that as our working capital. So that's our working capital or unrestricted cash. Now if you recall, that was in the first year of merger. We also made, if you recall, we made a $65 million surplus during that year. So at the end of 2017, we had effectively $70 million of working capital unrestricted cash. Since that time, you will recall that we had accumulated losses. So we've had accumulated losses then, and I'll include the 115 that we're forecasting for this year. So if I include that, we have 232 million of accumulated losses. We can take away the 70 million that we had from the working capital, which actually gives us a loss of working capital, or a deficit position, of 162 million. Then the council went and spent an extra 69 million on capital. So that actually takes, when the average should be about 170. So that actually takes it up to around the 231 million loss. But buried in the accounts back there, and I have to take it out from a cash perspective, there was $35 million, which is legitimately a paper loss. This is because we had we sold some assets below what's called their book value. So when you have an asset like a motor vehicle, it'll have a book value. You will depreciate it at, say, 10% per annum. So after 2 years, you've got 20% less your value. So a $100,000 vehicle would be $80,000. But if you sell it for $60,000, you've actually got to book that loss in, that 20 million. So, but that's not a cash loss. You haven't lost money. So when you take that out away from the 230, that's how you end up an actual cash loss of around the 200 million, which is the number Dick and I talked about right from day one, which was the amount of money that was actually utilised from the restricted reserves, both external and internally restricted reserves. So that's how we derived it. It was no more or less simple than that. generally in the bank account at the time, there's around $300 to $400 million. So there's still quite a lot of money sitting in our bank account, but it is restricted. It is only for use for specific purposes. But we're in deficit to the tune of $200 million, which needs to be repaid back. So that's why we've looked to repay that back. The way we're going to do that is about 50 to 60 million is going to be done by asset sales. There's about 30 to 40 million that's going to be done by Dick, the administrator, actually, I'll call writing off, but when they're internally restricted, council can unrestrict those without any problem. So we'll just unrestrict those, which gets rid of that loss there, which brings us down to the 100 odd million we've got of externally restricted reserves, which we need to repay back. Our 10-year plan that we've got, which you will see come out shortly, demonstrates that at the end of 10 years we have made about 112 million, which will repay all of that debt back. That still leaves bank debt in situ in the organisation, which is not such a problem because we're on pretty reasonable terms with that, and it's all funded for in those 10-year plan.
In the budgets going forward. Can you explain to us the next slide here before we go on?
Then the next slide this is what we looked at in order to what makes up the $115 million year-end forecast. There's two things that have not changed very much from last year's actuals. You can see it was around 634. This is when we lost the 90 million. 634 in terms of total income. You'll see that we're forecasting the income for this year at around 635. So it's, we're not seeing much change from the original budget, which was 653. We're looking at here in the cost line, what has changed dramatically. You can see the original budget, the last year was 220. The budget for last year, the 20 year ended 30th of June 2020, was 200 odd million. We've increased that by 50 odd million to make a number of totally around 251. And this is because we've actually taken money to pay for the reduction of staff. So they've all, so we've budgeted around 45 million, and that's what the $100 million loan for is, enable us to be able to fund the change in the organisation to downsize it, because it costs us to get down to a range of things. The other thing is, because we spend a lot more money on capital, we actually have to increase the depreciation line quite substantially. So also you have a $30 million extra in depreciation against the original budget, which does mean, turns at the bottom line into the $115 million loss. So we have to turn that loss for year in here. Just for completeness, I'll mention the administrator agreed with the financial analysis at the end of the second quarter, which projected a loss of 107 million. So we've made some gains of about $8 million at the moment, and I would expect that we'll have further gains there because I don't expect to have to spend all of that $45 million on redundancies and so on.
It's a contingency for worst case scenario.
It's contingency, and anything we don't spend in there is then just money left over at the bottom dollars from a cash point of view, which gives us better and more working capital for the future. So it strengthens the overall council position. So
two things just to wrap up. The accumulated debt, to be clear, prior to amalgamation was a certain figure. I think it was around $300 million. That's the accumulated debt. Yep. That both of those councils, Gosford and Wyong. Is that the case? Is that the starting point?
I couldn't tell you exactly what debt both councils came into it with. What we reported was 565 debt, which was we must remember is a moment in time. So when we did this work at the end of that end of October, that was our debt. It included the $200 million which I've shown, and the balance, the other 365 thereabouts, is bank debt. We have a number of loans from different lenders, all of them with slightly varying interest rates, but all roughly amortised or payable over 15 years. So every month we're repaying principal and interest on those loans. So you will see that debt loading coming back. So if you think about it, amortised over 15 years, that's all budgeted for. So those payments are all budgeted in these years and in the out years that we're looking over the next 10 years. So we will come down, if we repay that, those external things, that'll bring it down to around 365. or by the time we've done that, that other bank debt will have come down dramatically. So if you imagine 10 years, we'll have eliminated most of that debt entirely.
And finally, Rik, would you explain for the readers, the viewers, the listeners, the difference between internal and external debt in the council context?
Happy to. Look, the internal debt, we worked through the numbers and the sheets I had in front of me, we came up with a figure of 200 million, which is approximately roughly 100 million odd in terms of internally restricted reserves and 100 million of externally restricted reserves. Bear in mind that is as applicable at around the end of October last year. So that's the internal, what we call internal debt. The external debt is what we borrow from the banks. So recently we borrowed $50 million, I think during November, and then we borrowed another 100 million, just as you know, right on the cusp of Christmas. So the total debt is around around the 565 mark back in October. But every month we are paying off the principal and interest on a number of those loans. That's the external debt I'm talking about. So we're paying off principal and interest on those. Most of the loans are amortised or payable back over 15 years. So it's quite substantial chunks of principal are being repaid back. So every month that debt loading is coming down. What happens when, and the administrator announced the other day that the debt had dropped by nearly 100 million. So partly that means that in that original 565 is that 100 million we just took out prior to Christmas. So all of that's in there. So once we get that money comes in, we can offset some of that, like an offset account you can have. So your net debt position drops quite dramatically, but it could go back up again if we have to reuse some of the money. So it's like it goes up and down, it will ebb and flow. But over time, it's always going to be dropping because we are paying principal and interest back on those loans. So on that 365 round numbers of external debt, we're repaying that over 15 years predominantly. Pretty much all of them are on a 15-year term, and some of them are well advanced, so they're coming down, and the most recent one has still got 15 years to run on it, obviously. Does that clarify for you? That
does a great deal, and it gives us some confidence in understanding that, or the people who go through this to unpack it all and answer some of those questions. We understand you have a new CEO, which will be announced, imminently.
Imminently, yes.
Imminently, and just finally, you mentioned in previous interviews that there would be a financial oversight controller attached to the council. Is that still part of the plan?
The government's in a position where they have to make a decision, and the minister has to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to hold an inquiry. And if they hold an inquiry, what an inquiry will mean is that it will go much longer than up past the next election. And that will mean if that does happen, the minister can suspend the councillors during that period of the inquiry, and then you would actually have a situation where you would have to go a further 3 years before there could be another election where councillors could come back.
Could be elected.
So that's a possibility that could happen in that case. The other thing is that councillors could be determined that because the situation is relatively clear, and it's not like there's massive. It doesn't need a great deal of understanding, as hopefully I've explained today. It's actually just people took their eye off the ball and just kept spending money when they didn't have it. So if councillors came back, then the government is most likely to appoint a role they call the financial controller, and that financial controller just is there to make sure that there isn't over expenditure during the period up to the election. It would only last up to the election. It is just there to make sure it's an oversight role, just to check that people stay within the budget that's been set.
All right, thank you for the interview with Central Coast Newspapers.
Thank you.